virtually every intervention that happened in the Cold War era, from Afghanistan to Korea, in the post-World War II Cold War era, all the way until the dissolution of the USSR, virtually every single foreign intervention that America conducted was done in incredibly violent ways to directly destabilize these nations and punish them for the crime of having Soviet sympathies. Okay? In many circumstances, the people that were killed in this process, sometimes due to the incompetence of the Soviet-aligned governments and incompetence born out of the fears of being destabilized, and oftentimes, more frequently than that, the direct violence of the American-aligned puppet states that were beefed up and defended by, sometimes like in the case of Korea, direct American military action, okay, has led to countless instances of straightforward, not ethnic cleansing, but at least like ideologically cleansing the population. If you look at places like Indonesia, the numbers are in not even the tens of thousands, not even the hundreds of thousands, but almost a million. I think more than a million, as a matter of fact. And in Korea, it's tens of thousands before the Korean War. So these guys, like the things that the American aligned governments did are endlessly inhumane. And the reasons as to why they did it was because they did not want, no matter what, they did not want any sort of USSR involvement, any sort of soft power initiatives that still are in place in the new Cold War that we're currently experiencing against China. Now, you can look at that situation and be like, well, look at the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, which is true. That is something worthy of much criticism, right? Oh, they're implementing a cultural genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. How dare you refuse to reckon with that reality? Okay? I do not hide that. I do not, act like that's not a real thing that's happening. I have talked about this many times over. Having said that, however, like, think about that within the context of what is also ongoing with our foreign allies, an extension of the United States of American empire, Israel, and what Israel is doing in Gaza. Okay? But Harrison said the Soviet Union was never scheming towards the Indian Ocean, adding Brzezinski promoted confrontation between Washington and Moscow in the Afghan arena. Brzezinski's hardline policy towards the Soviet Union was reflected in his policy towards Afghanistan. Over the 10 years, the CIA pumped some $2 billion of aid, weapons, and logistical support to the Mujahideen, who fervently believed they were fighting a jihad. Washington was using resistance groups for its own anti-Soviet purposes, said Silik Harrison, South Asia expert at Washington-based Center for International Policy. Brzezinski knew that a communist country's invasion of a Muslim state would raise the hackles of the Muslim world. In a memo to former President Carter, the National Security Advisor said, Muslim countries will be concerned and we might be in a position to exploit this. Yeah, this is Mika Brzezinski's father, by the way, ironically, for those of you who do not know. Morning Joe, Mika. That's who this man is. The Mujahideen put up fierce resistance. They employed guerrilla tactics against the Soviets by launching successful raids before disappearing into the numerous caves tucked into Afghanistan's many mountains. The majority of aid from Washington went to the faction led by strongman Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan Robert Newman described as an extremist and a very violent man. In 1987, the United States provided handheld Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to the resistance fighters. With these deadly missiles, the Mujahideen shot down Soviet planes and helicopters daily. Following the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, some elements of the Mujahideen evolved into groups Washington today includes in its so-called war against terror, including the Taliban. The blowback effect is quite far-flung, said Harrison. We still have Stinger missiles turning up in strange places, he added. While it seemed like a good idea at the time to provide Mujahideen with CIA training, funding, equipment, Afghanistan evolved into a breeding ground for Islamist groups, which had little love for the U.S. either. Most prominent figure to rise from Afghanistan is Osama bin Laden, leader of the al-Qaeda group, accused by Washington of masterminding the September 11th attacks in New York and Washington. The CIA followed a myopic, short-sighted policy in Afghanistan by focusing its energies on only trying to make it hot for the Soviets and disregarding the agendas of groups it supported, said Harrison. These groups were using CIA aid to fight the Soviets to prepare for the day to fight the United States, he said. When asked if he regretted supporting these factions to fight the Soviets, Brzezinski replied, and this is in 1998, by the way, an interview that he gave boasting about his involvement, goading the USSR to invade Afghanistan because it would lead inevitably to its own version of Vietnam. He said, pre 9/11, he said, "What's more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War?" A statement that would haunt him, even though, of course, not many people bring this up, with the exception of the likes of people like myself and maybe the Blowback podcast. But for those who know, this was damning for Brzezinski, considering that he very openly showed the short-sighted nature of American intervention, overlooking the concept of blowback. From the onset of the invasion, the United States had no genuine concerns for the problems of the Central Asian states, said Harrison. When Washington was satisfied it had beaten the Soviets, it turned its back on Afghanistan and allowed the country to slide into turmoil. I won't say what current Eastern European nation is experiencing similarities. This time, there is no ideological component associated with it, and it's a pure irredentist versus imperialist battle. Okay? I just won't say anything. So, is it really short-sighted policy if you know you can use blowback as a consent manufacturing for future interventions? It is short-sighted policy if you personally think you can evade a blowback and at least like shelter Americans domestically from the potential consequences, or at least greatly limit those consequences. Because 3,000 dead Americans in the heart of empire is still a striking blow. Okay? Like, taking advantage of that chaos is one thing, which of course the American government did. But it's short-sighted because no government, no competent government, no fucking real no real government wants their own citizens to get this devastating fucking blow.